The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Patrick's Cathedral, casting rainbow prisms across Isabela Munro's ivory silk gown. At 25, she embodied the refined beauty expected of New York's most prominent Spanish-American heiress, dark eyes that held both intelligence and vulnerability, a composure learned through years of diplomatic training, and the quiet strength that came from knowing she was born to rule over one of America's most influential financial empires. Today was supposed to be the culmination of a promise made at her birth, her wedding to Duke William Ashford, the English nobleman whose railroad fortune had made him the most sought-after bachelor in the Gilded Age. But as the cathedral bells chimed 9 o'clock, Isabela stood alone at the altar, her bouquet of white orchids trembling in her hands. The murmurs from the assembled crowd of Manhattan's elite grew louder with each passing minute. Mrs. Astor whispered behind her fan to the Vanderbilt matriarch, while railroad magnates and steel barons shifted uncomfortably in their pews. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a merger of two of America's most powerful dynasties, Spanish gold and English industry, a union that would reshape the financial landscape of the continent. The cathedral doors burst open, and Isabela's heart leaped, thinking William had finally arrived. Instead, her younger sister Catalina glided down the aisle in an identical wedding gown, her arm linked with William's. At 19, Catalina possessed a different kind of beauty. Blonde where Isabela was brunette, impulsive where Isabela was measured, charming where Isabela was dignified. The crowd gasped audibly as William's voice carried through the cathedral. "I choose Catalina Munro as my bride." The contract transfers to her by right of substitution. Isabela's world shattered in that moment, but her training as the daughter of the Munro financial empire held her upright. She had been raised to navigate crises that could topple governments and bankrupt nations. As she watched her sister take her place, Isabela noticed something that others missed: the fear in William's eyes, the way his hands shook as he spoke, the barely perceptible nod he gave to someone in the back pew. This wasn't love or sudden passion, this was coercion. In the crowd, Henry Morrison, known in New York social circles as the King of Steel, though his friends called him Harry, smiled with cold satisfaction. At 53, Morrison had built his fortune through ruthless manipulation and strategic destruction of his competitors. His thick frame and penetrating gaze commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He had specific reasons for despising Isabela Munro, reasons that traced back to a humid summer evening in Newport 15 years ago when they first met. The memory came flooding back to Isabela as she fled the cathedral. She was 10 years old, attending her first formal dinner at the Morrison estate in Newport. Her father, seeking to expand the Munro influence into steel production, had arranged the meeting. Young Isabela, precocious and unafraid, had wandered into Morrison's private study and discovered documents that detailed his plan to manipulate railroad contracts through bribery and intimidation. When Morrison found her reading, she looked up with those intelligent dark eyes and said, "Mr. Morrison, my father says business should be conducted with honor. These papers suggest otherwise." Even as a child, Isabela possessed a moral compass that Morrison found both admirable and threatening. Morrison had laughed then, ruffling her hair and calling her a clever little thing. But privately, he realized that Isabela Munro would grow into the kind of woman who could see through his carefully constructed empire of corruption. As she matured into a young woman with her father's business acumen and her mother's diplomatic skills, Morrison watched her influence grow within New York's Spanish-American community. She had become a bridge between the old European aristocracy and America's new industrial titans, someone who could expose his methods, or worse, replace his power entirely. Now, as Isabela gathered her silk skirts and ran from the cathedral, Morrison's plan was in motion. He had discovered William's secret, that his English ducal title was purchased, not inherited, and that his railroad fortune was built on fraudulent government contracts. Morrison had presented William with a choice: marry the easily manipulated Catalina Munro, who would sign whatever documents were placed before her, or have his crimes exposed to both American authorities and the British Crown. William, facing financial ruin and potential imprisonment, had chosen survival over love. But Morrison's scheme went deeper than simply controlling the Munro fortune through Catalina. He had learned that Isabela's mother, the late Duchess Eleanor Munro, had been born illegitimate, a secret that would invalidate Isabela's claim to the Spanish holdings that formed the foundation of the Munro Empire. If this information became public, Isabela would be left with nothing, and Morrison could acquire her father's steel interests at a fraction of their value. 3 months after the wedding, New York's social season reached its peak with the Autumn Prosperity Ball, hosted by the newly married Duke and Duchess Ashford at their Fifth Avenue mansion. The event's ostensible purpose was to celebrate the merger of the Ashford and Munro enterprises, but Morrison had orchestrated it as a trap. He had invited European nobility, government officials, and financial titans, creating the perfect audience for Isabela's public destruction. Isabela arrived fashionably late, wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that made her look like a queen in exile. She had spent the month since her humiliation not in mourning, but in investigation. Using her connections in both Spanish and American financial circles, she had uncovered the web of corruption that connected Morrison's steel empire to fraudulent railroad contracts, bribed senators, and manipulated elections. More importantly, she had discovered Morrison's own secret, that his fortune was built on stolen patents and that his real name was Heinrich Moritz, a German immigrant who had reinvented himself after embezzling from his first employer in Pennsylvania. As the ball swirled around them, Morrison approached Isabela on the marble terrace overlooking Central Park. The autumn air was crisp, and gas lamps cast dancing shadows through the bare tree branches. "Miss Monroe," he said with false warmth, "how lovely to see you've recovered from your disappointment." Isabela turned to face him, her composure perfect despite the anger burning in her chest. "Mr. Morrison, or should I say Heinrich Moritz, I've learned so much about disappointment lately, and about deception." Her voice was silk wrapped around steel. "Did you enjoy orchestrating my sister's wedding? It must have been satisfying to finally control the Monroe fortune." Morrison's smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Your sister made a fortunate match. William saw her qualities more clearly than he initially realized." "William saw your evidence of his fraudulent contracts more clearly, you mean?" Isabela stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "You forced him to choose between exposure and compliance. But you made one critical error, Henry. You assumed I would simply accept defeat." Inside the ballroom, Catalina danced with her new husband, blissfully unaware that William spent every moment scanning the room for Morrison's approval. The young Duchess had signed document after document since their wedding, trusting her husband's assurances that they were routine business papers. In reality, she had unknowingly transferred control of key Monroe holdings to shell companies controlled by Morrison's steel empire. Isabela had been building her own network during those 3 months. She had reached out to European contacts, Spanish nobility who had known her mother, and American investigators who specialized in industrial espionage. Tonight, she would reveal everything she had learned, but not in the dramatic confrontation Morrison expected. Instead, she would use his own methods against him: strategic manipulation and perfectly timed information release. As the evening progressed, Isabela moved through the ballroom like a chess master positioning pieces. She whispered to Senator Bradley about Morrison's bribes, showed Mrs. Astor documents proving the stolen patents, and revealed to the British consul evidence of William's fraudulent contracts. Each conversation was brief, casual, seemingly social, but devastating in its implications. The climax came during the traditional toast to the new couple. Isabela rose gracefully, her champagne glass catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. "To my dear sister Catalina and her husband William," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom. "May their union be built on the same foundation of trust and transparency that has always defined the Monroe family enterprises." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. "In that spirit of transparency, I have wonderful news to share. The Monroe family has always believed in ethical business practices, which is why we're divesting from any partnerships that don't meet our moral standards." Her eyes found Morrison in the crowd. "Effective immediately, we're terminating all contracts with Morrison Steel and calling in the loans we've extended to their subsidiary companies." Morrison's face went pale as he realized the implications. Isabela had found a way to legally destroy him without revealing her own investigation. By simply withdrawing Monroe's support he had been counting on to cover his fraudulent activities, she could trigger a cascade of investigations that would expose everything. But Isabela wasn't finished. "Additionally, I'm pleased to announce that the Spanish crown has validated my mother's legitimate birth certificate, which was recently discovered in Madrid's cathedral archives. This documentation confirms the Monroe family's rightful claim to all Spanish holdings, including those that were recently redirected through subsidiary agreements." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Morrison had built his entire scheme on the assumption that Isabela's illegitimate birth would invalidate her inheritance. But Isabela had spent her 3 months of exile not wallowing in defeat, but traveling to Spain and working with church authorities to locate the original records that proved her mother's legitimate birth and noble status. Catalina, finally understanding that her husband and marriage had been used as weapons against her own sister, broke away from William and approached Isabela with tears in her eyes. "Isabela, I never knew. I thought William had simply chosen love over arrangement. If I had understood." Isabela embraced her sister, speaking quietly enough that only Catalina could hear. "You were innocent in this, Lena. The blame belongs to those who used your heart as a weapon." She looked over Catalina's shoulder directly at Morrison. "But that manipulation ends tonight." William, facing exposure and financial ruin, attempted to salvage the situation. Isabela, surely we can reach some understanding. The contracts Catalina signed were legitimate business arrangements. Contracts signed under false pretenses by someone who believed she was acting in her family's interest, Isabela replied calmly. Any lawyer will confirm they're null and void due to fraudulent inducement. The question is whether you'll cooperate in untangling this mess or whether you'll force me to involve federal investigators. Morrison, realizing his position was hopeless, made one final desperate play. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. Your accusations are the bitter revenge of a woman scorned. Isabela smiled then, an expression that combined her mother's diplomatic grace with her father's business ruthlessness. Mr. Moritz, I have documentation of every fraudulent transaction, every bribed official, and every stolen patent that built your empire. More importantly, I have something you never expected: patience and the Monroe family's reputation for keeping our promises. She paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. I promised myself that justice would be served for what you did to my family. Consider that promise fulfilled. As federal investigators, prepositioned by Isabela's months of careful planning, entered the ballroom to arrest Morrison on charges of fraud and conspiracy, Isabela felt the weight of her family's honor settling back on her shoulders. She had lost a fiancé and gained a sister's betrayal, but she had preserved the Monroe legacy and ensured that corruption would not triumph over integrity. The final scene unfolded 6 months later in the Monroe family's private garden behind their Fifth Avenue mansion. Spring had returned to New York, and Isabela stood among the blooming roses her mother had planted years before. Catalina approached hesitantly, still wearing black mourning dress, not for death, but for the ending of her brief, manipulated marriage. "Will you ever forgive me?" Catalina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Isabela turned to face her sister, seeing not the woman who had stolen her wedding day, but the girl who had been used as a pawn in Morrison's game. "There's nothing to forgive, Lena. We were both victims of the same manipulation. The question is whether we can rebuild what was broken." As the sisters embraced in the garden where they had played as children, Isabela realized that Morrison's greatest miscalculation had been assuming that destroying her would strengthen his position. Instead, his betrayal had forged her into something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. A woman who understood that true power came not from manipulation and fear, but from integrity and the patience to see justice done properly. The Monroe Empire not only survived Morrison's attack, but expanded into new territories, always with the ethical standards that Isabela's mother had instilled and her father had practiced. William Ashford, cooperating with authorities in exchange for reduced charges, provided evidence that brought down an entire network of Gilded Age corruption, from railroad executives to Senate leaders. In the end, Isabela had learned that being left at the altar had been not an ending, but a beginning. The moment she stopped being the woman others expected her to be and became the leader her family's legacy deserved.